This man is Steve. He is a salesperson who worked for a natural gas industrial company known as the Global Company. One day, he was interviewed by the manager because he would be assigned to go to a small town in the southern US for a negotiation. The negotiation was to get the residents' permission to build a natural gas drilling factory and avoid any constraints. After the interview, Steve immediately left for the town by bus. When he arrived at the bus stop, Steve met his co-worker named Sue. They then left together using Sue's car. Both of their tasks started as soon as they arrived at their destination. Steve went to the first house. Steve started to explain to the owner of the house about his purpose for coming there. With his brilliant ability as a reliable salesman, he convinced that person that if he decided to sell his land, he would get a massive profit and become a millionaire. On the other hand, Sue also did the same thing, but rather than seriously explaining the deal, she instead did her work casually. She even had the time to interact with her client's son. After their work was finished, they returned to the hotel where they stayed. But when Steve was about to enter his room, he suddenly got a message from his client earlier, saying that the client decided to agree to the offer and was willing to sell his land. The next day, Steve went to meet the town's mayor named Jerry at a restaurant. There, Steve intended to ask Jerry's permission to gather the residents. He then explained his purpose for coming to the town was to build a natural gas industrial factory. Hearing that, Jerry was shocked. He immediately refused the idea. He said that if the project went wrong, the consequences might be fatal. It would have a bad impact on the environment. Steve immediately cut him off by offering Jerry a big amount of profit. He explained that from each house that agreed to sell their land, Jerry will get a profit of 0.1% or $30,000 per house. Hearing that tempting offer, Jerry finally agreed to help gather the residents. In the evening, Steve went to the bar to enjoy his time. When he was ordering a drink, Steve saw a beautiful woman who was ordering a drink as well. That woman said that that day was her birthday. They got acquainted and talked a lot. That woman was Alice, an elementary school teacher in the same town where Steve worked. Then they spent the night together drinking. In the morning, Steve woke up and found himself in Alice's house. He was so drunk last night he forgot that he ended up there. He also forgot about the meeting he had to attend that day with Jerry. He then rushed and immediately said goodbye. Before he left, Alice said that they both didn't do anything that night. Steve was too drunk, he went straight to the couch and slept all night. Steve rushed to the place where the residents gathered. After arriving there, he saw Jerry explaining to the residents that a big drilling project will be started in that town. He also invited the residents there to support the construction of the project. Out of nowhere, an old man immediately cut off Jerry's speech. The old man named Frank. He was a high school teacher and turned out to understand the consequences of the gas drilling project. He also explained to Jerry that he was the first person who would oppose the construction of the project. Steve, who watched both of them argue, suddenly went in front of everyone and told Frank about the project. As a result of the project, it would lift the residents' financial status. They would profit a lot of money if they decided to sell their land. Hearing Steve's explanation, Frank said that the deal was nothing but about money. He only thought about the profit and not the consequences for the environment if the project ended up running. The impact might greatly affect the residents, like the pollution leak to the water supply, diseases that might emerge and infect the livestock, or land pollution that might prevent the farmer from using it to grow their crops. Steve instead implied that Frank's worries about the development side effect did not have any strong evidence. Steve then told Frank not to talk about things that made the residents confused, but then the residents immediately stood up to support Frank. Frank then asked Jerry to hold a vote within the next 3 weeks. If Steve didn't manage to win the vote, he had to leave the town, but if he did, the residents would permit him to start the project development. That night in their room, Steve and Sue were scolded by their boss. They were given the ultimatum to finish the project permit as soon as possible, or else, if they failed, they would be sent home and discharged from their project. The next day, Frank was in his room when he was visited by an environmental activist named Dustin. He offered to help Frank to support him in opposing Steve's drilling project. He also showed Frank some pictures to prove the impact of the natural gas drilling development. At night, Steve and Sue went to the bar to enjoy the night. Inside the bar, Sue suddenly came to the stage and sang to relieve her stress. On the other hand, Steve met Alice again. She came only to give her phone number and then left. After Sue finished singing, suddenly Dustin immediately went up on stage and introduced himself to the visitors, saying that he was an environmental activist and would protect their environment from the global company that would destroy the environment by running an industrial project in their town. Dustin also told that he and his family were farmers before, but they went bankrupt because their land was polluted, thanks to natural gas industrial development. Now he chose to become an environmental activist and rejected all projects related to the natural gas company. He then invited them all to join him in rejecting the construction of the detrimental project. When they saw Dustin, Steve and Sue decided to immediately leave the bar. When the two of them were in front of the hotel where they were staying, it turned out that Dustin was also staying at the same hotel. What Dustin had done earlier made some major disadvantages to their projects and made Steve mad. Sue immediately separated the two of them and gave him an envelope filled with money so Dustin wouldn't interfere in their affair anymore. The next day, when Steve and Sue were out in the town to offer the project, they saw a sign that said "Global Go Home" along the way. Not long after, they also saw Dustin at one of the residents' houses. Witnessing that, Steve then got out of the car and approached him. Steve was furious and said that Dustin had done too far. Dustin replied that he did all this because he didn't want to see what happened to him before with his family happening again. Steve then asked Dustin to return the money that was given the night before, but Dustin said that he used the money to make the signpost they just saw. Steve couldn't do anything but left in anger. They only had a few days left before the voting day. Steve was terrorized by the campaign that Dustin did, like when he woke up and saw a poster that said "Global Go Home," or when he was about to start the car and saw the poster all over the windshield. Sometime later, Steve and Sue decided to continue their job, but wherever they went, they always got rejected. On the other hand, Dustin was teaching in the elementary school where Alice worked. It turned out that Dustin had already known Alice closer than Steve. After finishing his work, Steve took the time to stop by Alice's house. There, he was immediately invited to the backyard, which was so wide. Alice told him that she lived all alone and only inherited the house she lived in right now. Before her father died, he once said to sell the land if one day Alice needed money, but she refused because the house was their family inheritance. Steve then told her that right now, he was very stressed because his efforts to offer the development projects were always rejected by the residents. He also said that if this continued, he would leave the town sooner. Steve went to the bar to contemplate, but at that time, he was approached by some men who opposed Steve's job as a salesman for an environment-destroying company. Driven by his frustration, Steve said that he did all this because of money. He also asked the men how much money they had earned all this time becoming a farmer and how much money they collected for their entire life. With this project, the residents whose finances were arguably low would get the money they never got before. Hearing Steve's words, the man was offended and then beat his face.
Think about how much you made on your best day. These people, this town, it is dying. You're an asshole.
Despite all of that, Steve refused to give up. He wondered what could be the best solution to invite the residents of the town to support his projects. After thinking about it, he finally got an idea. The idea was to hold a festival. In the early morning, Steve immediately carried out the idea. In the afternoon, Sue brought some help from the town to help Steve with the work. In the evening, Steve went to the bar with the other workers. There, he met Dustin. Different from the last time, he wasn't upset meeting him and instead asked the bartender to serve Dustin something to drink. But when they started to get to know each other and chat together, suddenly Alice came to see Dustin and asked him to go out with her. Steve got jealous and couldn't say anything. Alice, whom he knew who didn't have any male friends, was asking Dustin to go out with her. Not only that. The next day, the festival that Steve had worked so hard to make for the residents was cancelled due to the heavy rain.
We lost. God damn it!
Not long after, Frank invited Steve and Sue to his house. Frank welcomed them kindly, even though he was the first person who opposed their project. Steve, who was disappointed with what had happened, couldn't do anything but be silent while drinking a glass of wine. Frank then tried to cheer Steve by saying that he was a good man, but after all, Frank would continue to protect the town from all things that would damage it. He was too old to live in a polluted area because of industrial development. Hearing Frank's words, Steve was moved and suddenly realized that all this time, he had been doing all these things to harm other people. At night in the hotel lobby, Steve was called by the receptionist because he got a package sent for him. When he opened it, it turned out that the package contained many pictures of farm animals that died from the impact of the industrial pollutant. Steve realized that the picture was Dustin's picture, which he had seen some time ago, but Steve then felt something wrong with the photo. There was a building that looked like a lighthouse, which meant that the picture was taken on the beach. Steve remembered that he never built any industrial project near the beach. That only meant that the animals in the pictures were not dead because of industrial pollution. Upon realization, he rushed to Sue's room and showed the evidence. Sue was shocked to see the evidence. She then said that they had the evidence to win the vote. They then called Jerry to tell him the truth. That night, Steve went to Alice's house to tell her the truth directly. Steve said that he was not a bad person and just wished the best for the residents. He also confessed his feelings to her. When Steve returned to the hotel, he met Dustin in front of the hotel. Dustin seemed to be leaving after all his lies were exposed because Jerry had told all the residents about Dustin's lies. Steve had won the vote. All the residents that were against his idea had now turned to his side. Instead of being happy, Steve looked confused. He felt something was wrong. He wondered what was Dustin's intention by sending him all the pictures. Since there was no reason to cover his lies anymore, Dustin confessed that he intentionally did all his plans to prevent them from running their project. There was nothing but to help them. It turned out that he was also an employee of the global company. Dustin said that to be able to win people's hearts, there must be a competitive opponent who fought to defend their environment. Then, when the residents had completely trusted the person, the next job was to make the residents disappointed by exposing his lies before the voting day arrived so that all the disappointed citizens turned to Steve, and finally, the global company would eventually win the vote because Steve managed to win their land. After explaining all of that, Dustin congratulated Steve and then immediately left the town. Finally, the day they had been waiting for arrived. On voting day, It was certain that Steve would win and that the residents would approve the project development that was offered before. But now Steve had changed his mind. After realizing the cunning strategy of the global company to take over the land of the residents, Steve finally realized what business really meant and how evil the world of business is. While waiting for his turn to give a speech before the voting began, he contemplated that if it wasn't him who protected the land of the residents there, then nobody would. Steve finally chose to stand with the residents and opposed his own project. When it was Steve's turn to enter the hall, he revealed all his heart to all the residents. Steve, who had been trying so hard to ask the residents to give up their land, said that now he would stand with the residents and join them in guarding their land together. After successfully canceling the vote, Steve went outside to chase after Sue. Since the event was over, Sue decided to return to the city and asked him to come along with her, but Steve, who had fallen in love with that town, decided to stay there with the residents. Not long after, a scene showed Steve who came to Alice's house. They eventually lived together.